Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There is a very real prospect of the government being taken to court over sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is leading a coalition in Yemen against rebel fighters in a conflict which has cost almost 6,000 lives, among them many civilians. The issue is whether these weapons, in particular laser-guided bombs, have been involved in civilian deaths, a question that arose in a Newsnight interview with the Foreign Secretary. Now, lawyers for Campaign Against Arms Trade says the UK government is in breach of UK, European and international law. A separate legal opinion, prepared for Amnesty International and seen by Newsnight, says the UK is in breach of its own legislation, including the Arms Trade Treaty, which the government has championed. Gabriel Gatehouse has the story. You may find some images in this film distressing.
Yemen has been under almost constant bombardment since March. A coalition led by Saudi Arabia has been trying to defeat a rebel army. Both sides have been accused of war crimes. But now lawyers say Britain could be breaking the law for selling the bombs that the Saudis are dropping. On the night of July 24th, coalition warplanes repeatedly struck a residential compound in the port city of Mocha. At least 65 civilians were killed, according to Human Rights Watch, who collected this footage and visited the site soon after the strike. The group says the compound was nearly a kilometre away from any military target.
السلام كان هنا، السلام كان يحم هنا، الفرحة والبسمة الأطفال كانت هنا، انتهت. راحت نتيجة الحرب.
The strike on Mocha is just one of many incidents where civilians have apparently been targeted in Saudi-led airstrikes. Earlier this year, we visited the remains of a water bottling plant which had been struck. The owner of the factory showed us a list of names. 13 workers were killed, including a teenage boy. The Saudi-led campaign has the backing of the UN Security Council, which gives it legitimacy under international law. The UK supports the coalition and, along with the United States and others, has been supplying some of the weapons used in the conflict. But attacks directed against civilians or civilian objects constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law.
Now, the UK has a very clear legal regime, and that legal regime says that the UK won't provide licences for arms exports if there is a clear risk there may be violations of international humanitarian law. Now, the facts on the ground of what's happening in Yemen suggest there is that clear risk.
And yet the government has continued to grant export licences for arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. Lawyers for the group Campaign Against the Arms Trade told us they will take the government to court unless it stops. From the very beginning, the British government's response to these allegations has been to say that they've received repeated assurances from the Saudis that British weapons are being used in accordance with international law. But privately, I've been told that government lawyers and indeed officials are very worried indeed about the possibility of a legal challenge. At issue is whether the UK has done enough to satisfy itself that British weapons are not being used to commit war crimes. That is a requirement under the Arms Trade Treaty, which David Cameron championed and which came into force last year. A key piece of evidence cited by the lawyers came in an interview on Newsnight with the Foreign Secretary.
The Saudis deny that there have been any breaches of international humanitarian law. Obviously, that denial alone is not enough. We need to see proper investigations.
That admission is significant, say the authors of a separate legal opinion prepared for Amnesty International by 3 prominent lawyers.
The British government has confirmed that it's aware of the allegations that violations of international law are being committed on the ground in Yemen. And it is also aware that the assurances being given by the Saudi authorities are perhaps not watertight. That heightens the degree of scrutiny which they ought to be applying in the determination of whether any new weapons should be supplied.
The 90-page legal opinion concludes, on the basis of the evidence available to us, any authorization by the UK of the transfer of weapons or other items to Saudi Arabia in circumstances where such weapons are capable of being used in the conflict in Yemen would constitute a breach by the UK of its obligations under domestic, European and international law. The Saudis have consistently denied targeting civilians. They point out their campaign comes at the request of Yemen's internationally recognised government against a rebel force, the Houthis, who themselves stand accused of violating the laws of war. But Britain is not supplying weapons to the Houthis. A government spokesman told us, the UK government has stressed to the Saudi authorities the importance of conducting transparent investigations into all incidents where it's alleged that international humanitarian law has been breached. The UK government itself is not carrying out separate investigations into these incidents. Yemen is in the grip of one of the world's worst crises. Apart from the bombing, a blockade by coalition forces has caused acute shortages. We met people eating the leaves off thorn bushes in order to survive. A shaky ceasefire in place since yesterday has already been violated.
The government should use its influence, in my view, to make sure that the ceasefire holds. We have considerable influence with the Saudi regime and with the coalition. And making sure the ceasefire holds is the best way of stopping this sort of apparent division in government policy between, on the one hand, blockading the ports, which is what the Defence and Foreign Affairs are trying to do, whereas the humanitarian and development wing of the British government is trying to get food and medicines and fuel in through those same ports.
The arms trade treaty was supposed to make civilians safer in war zones. It was backed enthusiastically by the British government. Its first test may be in Yemen, concerning the use of British weapons.
Gabriel Gatehouse reporting, and we did ask the Saudi government onto the programme tonight, but that request was declined. And joining me now in the studio is the former Business Secretary, Sir Vince Cable, and from Geneva, Sir William Patey, the former UK Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Good evening to you both. The words that have been used by the lawyers tonight are clear risks. When you were Business Secretary, you had real concerns about particularly the guided laser bombs, the pave-way bombs. And what did you do about it?
Well, over that particular contract, but let me just go back a little bit. I mean, very few arms contracts, Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, were stopped by me or indeed questioned by ministers, because there is a very clear framework of law. It's called the Consolidated Criteria approved by Parliament. And so there are relatively few cases that are actually very controversial. I did challenge and indeed blocked this particular sale of basically bombs for the aircraft, largely because of a report that I had heard about at the time, which was uncorroborated but seemed plausible, about bombing of hospitals, and I challenged that. We had a very detailed set of conversations in government. This was during the election campaign, so we're not in our offices. But I was assured eventually by the Defence Secretary, who to his credit went into this in some detail, that British embedded personnel in Saudi Arabia, and we have people who are very closely involved with the Air Force there, would maintain close oversight of the Saudi Air Force activities in the same basis that the Americans currently have. And I was satisfied that extra measures were being put in place.
But the aircraft were on the runway, weren't they, ready to take these bombs?
Yes, and I was making myself unpopular by holding it up. But eventually I was given very clear assurances that there would be proper oversight, and I then authorised it.
Now, that oversight, the assurances, did you actually take legal advice?
Well, I had legal advice within my department. There are essentially three government departments involved: Defence, the Foreign Office, and BIS, my department, and we're all given official and legal advice when we make these decisions.
And you thought this advice then was watertight or balance of probability. Tell me what your honest reaction was.
Well, I was
to that.
having to make a judgment on the basis of good faith, but it seemed to me very clear that we're being given additional safeguards, and that's what I found it impossible to believe what I've heard today, that somehow civilian targets are being pursued by these bombing raids, because if British personnel had oversight, this couldn't possibly be happening.
And yet, we have a lot of people reporting that not only hospitals, the bottling plant and so forth, are being bombed. Now, whether or not that's with American weaponry or whatever, I mean, what the lawyers are saying is that there is a clear risk that these are British bombs.
Well,
and in your view, is that enough really to go ahead?
Well, this is a legal question.
Yes.
They'll have to test it in court, but. I mean, I was given assurances that we had sufficient oversight of the bombing activity to make sure that international humanitarian law would not be compromised.
Sir William Patey, the report tonight comes from highly respected lawyers who believe that the British government could be in breach of British, European and international law by supplying these particular weapons to Saudi Arabia. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm no lawyer, but I imagine there is some element of deliberate targeting that needs to be there. I agree with Vince Cable, I can't see why the Saudis would deliberately target civilians, because it would be so contrary to what they're trying to do in Yemen. As your report said, they're in support of a Security Council resolution. The Houthi rebellion are the aggressors, if you like, and they're trying to push that back. I mean, I was ambassador in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I know there was no deliberate targeting of civilians, but you can't guarantee that in a complex situation like Yemen or Iraq or Syria that civilians might not be accidentally hit. But I imagine the legal case will hinge on deliberate targeting, and I can't see why the Saudis would deliberately target civilians.
Yeah, but these paveway bombs are meant to be hugely accurate, and so then it's not as if it could just be collateral damage, could it?
Well, we've seen mistakes occur. Americans have made mistakes in Iraq and in Syria, so it is possible that mistakes were made. But the Saudis are trying to support the legitimate government in Yemen, trying to re-establish some sort of control and promote a political settlement. Targeting civilians would have no part in that, and would be foolish.
But what I'm really asking about that is, do you think the Saudis are perhaps as careful as other nations might be in pursuit of their goals here?
I don't see why they would be less careful. And I think obviously Britain has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and should be in a position to advise and to work with them. So I suspect that the British government will be talking to the Saudis and seeking the sort of reassurances, the measures they've put in place. I've seen statements from the Saudis and from other coalition members about the measures they have in place to ensure to try to ensure that there are no civilian casualties. So I suppose there'll be a close scrutiny of what these measures are.
But if indeed you have these civilian casualties in hospitals, in a bottling plant and so forth, in people's houses, and they do turn out to be as a result of British weapons being dropped, would you be comfortable with that, or do you think that is wholly unacceptable under law?
Well, if they were deliberately targeted, it would be unacceptable. I think that would be the issue. And if they were attributable to Saudi airstrikes and to British equipment.
So, William, let me put that to Vince Cable. I mean, would you make that distinction in modern warfare now when you see what's been actually happening in Yemen, that it's at the line between deliberate targeting and collateral damage? I mean, are you as comfortable with that?
Well, I think as Mr. Patey said, that there is quite a difficult balance to be struck. I mean, I would have thought that a prudent military activity wouldn't just be avoiding deliberate targeting, it would be taking all proper efforts to avoid civilian collateral damage. I mean, there are accidents, but they should be doing more than just not targeting.
Well, given just how central to Saudi's arsenal are British bombs, and how important they are to our export.
Well, it's more than just bombs. I mean,
yes, there's
there is a vast amount of equipment.
Vast amount of equipment. Do you think that Britain imposes the same standards on the relationship with Saudi in talking about this as they do with other nations?
Well, I think there is growing discomfort, actually, that we are very highly dependent on Saudi Arabia in a variety of areas, not just the supply of equipment, but for security, anti-terrorist operations, regional security, issues around human rights, which Michael Gove gave vent to a few weeks ago. And I think, even within this Conservative government, you have ministers who are thinking, well, actually, we're being rather compromised by an over-dependence. No reason why we shouldn't have dealings with Saudi Arabia, but it's got to be balanced.
But did you have worries, and were you discomfort over the nature of the relationship and how it was conducted with Saudi when you were Business Secretary, and indeed before?
Well, I think I had no problem with us exporting kit to Saudi Arabia. I mean, I was a champion of British manufacturing industry, and this was part of it. But I did worry that we were becoming over-dependent in a variety of different ways, and it was inhibiting our ability to say what needed to be said.
And so, in terms of saying what needs to be said, do you think now there should be an independent inquiry, at least given the nature of the allegations and given the seniority of the lawyers that are making them?
Well, there will now presumably be a legal process, and that has to happen. I think that there is a very good select committee in the House of Commons, the so-called quadripartite committee, which is set up specifically to pursue issues around arms export licensing, and I think they are the appropriate body to look at this.
Now, in Gabriel Gatehouse in his film said that his understanding was that government lawyers are very uncomfortable about this. Now, do you think the government is in some discomfort?
I don't know. I was there 7 months ago, and it was an uncomfortable subject at the time, but vast amount more is now known. I mean, at that stage, we only had some fragmentary reports.
Thank you both very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all.